and welcome back. This will be our third video in the Introduction to PDL series. Last time we introduced word classes as a way to store words together, keep our PDL compressed, easier to use, easier to write, read, and manage. Today we are talking about variables and macros. And variables and macros are another tool that we can use in PDL to achieve much of the same that we did with word classes. Basically, making sure we have good readable PDL. To use macros or variables, we simply need to select the M button in our PDL editor. And that will bring up an interface to allow us to look at the project, our own user, or server. This will just set where the PDL variable or macro will be stored. So if we'd like to have these exported alongside our project and only accessible within the specific project, we will select the project options and create our macros and variables here. So to create one, I simply need to select what I want to create. Do I want to create a macro or a variable? Right now we'll talk about variables. So right-click the variables and select Add Item. Now we'll need to give it a name. So previously we wanted to store words that were related to good ideas. We can do the same thing with variables. So let's call this good, like we did previously. Now what does a variable store? A word class stored simply lists of words, whereas a variable can actually store snippets of PDL itself. So if I wanted to create a list of words, capture with our PDL in our variable, then I'll just need to use that ORN function. So ORN, good, great, excellent, wonderful, and so on. So now to use this, I simply have that there, and now instead of using term, I can use the function variable. And we'll see how we have very similar results. So why would we want to use a variable instead of a word class? A word class allowed us to just list these and we didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. Well, because we can access PDL inside of a variable, that will allow us to store some perhaps more complicated expressions. So returning to our variables, let's create a new one. And suppose not only do we want to look for instances of positive words, but we want to create an expression that captures when the staff is evaluated as good. Because maybe we want to reuse this in several different locations. We want to use this sort of snippet of PDL in many different queries. So I'll call this one good staff. And I'll write it by maybe using near staff, and then I can use the term good that we had seen earlier. Okay. Now to call this good staff. And so this does all the things that we cared about earlier. So variables are useful when we want to store a little bit more complicated information. Maybe not just lists of words, but maybe some sort of PDL expression that we'd like to use often. So maybe we want to look for good staff, okay? And then if we'd like to look for very good staff, okay. So now we have a query that can find very nice staff, very friendly staff, very good staff, etc. Those are variables. Very useful for capturing snippets of PDL that we'd like to reuse in many different queries. So what about variables? Variables are very similar. Take a look. So suppose I want to create a query that looks for things that are evaluated as good. So I could use the near staff term good, and then if I would like to look at a different object, not staff, I could look for a near room term good. or near bed term good, and so on. But you see that this structure is the same thing each time. I'm having to rewrite near and then term good. The only thing I'm changing is that word, staff or room or bed, etc. I have to redo all of this. And if I have a long PDL expression, if I need to make some changes, I have to make some changes to all of them, and it's still not very good. So to make this a bit more efficient, I can create a macro. So I'll right-click macro and add an item. And I will call this good eval. I mean, for good evaluation. Okay. Next, I have to define some arguments. These are sort of like algebraic variables. They are stand-ins, they're wildcards that can take the place of input. And you can call them whatever you like, and I usually kind of refer to them as just letters in an algebraic sense. So I'll define the argument x. It's going to be some input. And then I need to define the macro expansion, or what am I looking for when I'm giving this input? Well, I'd like to look for near x and term good. So if x is staff, near staff term good. I can have x be the bed, or I can have x be whatever I want, really. So I'll use this. Alright. Now to use this, I just need to call the macro. It has a name. And then I need to provide it the input it's looking for. So if I'm looking for staff, I'll provide it the input staff. So it'll find wonderful staff, great staff. Right? That's the same as before. But if I'd like to look for room, I'll let the input be room. Now I can look for wonderful room, nice room, etc. Or if I look for maybe service. Great. So this is a way of creating kind of open-ended queries that you can just fill in with words as you go on. This allows you to have a similar structure for all your queries. I want something evaluated as good, and then allows you to fill in the object of that evaluation in different queries. And if I ever need to modify that, I don't need to go to each one of these queries and modify it. I can just go to the macro itself and then edit this PDL here. And then I'm good to go. So for macros, just need to name your macro, give it arguments, use your arguments in a PDL expression. And then to use the macro, just use the function called macro, tell it which macro you want to look at, and then provide the arguments that you want to input. And that's it. So that's macros and variables. They, like word classes, allow you to condense your code, simplify it, store it in kind of external locations. That way you only need to modify these external locations, and you don't need to worry about modifying each instance of your PDL code. So please make use of word classes, variables, and macros, as they make writing your queries much more manageable, efficient, and helps people read your macros. This is much easier to understand than a big PDL expression. If you want to know more about the PDL expression, you can always drill down. And of course, you can stack these and use these in combinations. We used a word class inside of a macro and inside of a variable. And so feel free to experiment and create these wonderful nested queries that allow you to be very accurate. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.